Church say amen. Amen. Thank you, Peter, for giving the hymn a musical setting. I like the pointing there. Very, very good. Spontaneous at that. When I first read this passage with all of its confusing back and forth, and John was first, no, Jesus was first, I started to call this sermon, Who's on First? But that was a little too trivial, so we've titled it First Things First, because that's what John was trying to put forth, the foundation of his gospel, and how he wanted everything that came after it to be interpreted through this lens of light. Now, many a pew Christian are shocked to discover that the Christmas story, usually that blended version of Matthew and Luke where the wise men show up at the manger, you're supposed to laugh at that. Wise men are in Matthew, mangers in Luke, and never the twain do meet. But it's not. But many a pew Christian simply assume that this kind of blended Christmas story is the introduction to the New Testament, as though there were some grand introduction to all of the 4 books of the gospel. But it simply is not that way. As we pilgrim Christians know, the 4 gospels stand independent of each other. They were created independently to some extent, and they stood independently for the first 2 centuries of the Christian era. So the people who read Mark may never have read Matthew, didn't know anything about the wise men. And the people who read Luke didn't know John. And that's the way Christianity evolved in the first century or so. So each community had their own way of telling how Jesus came to be. Luke told it his way, Matthew told it his way, Mark told it his way, and John told it this way. So one might say that these first verses of John's gospel are his Christmas story. Now, John does not have the immaculate conception of Luke, but he does have a divine conception story. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's John's way of presenting his divine conception story of how Jesus became divine. You might also say that this is John's version of the incarnation, but without all that messy biology. But as he lays out his version of how Jesus came to be, he lays out a profound theology of humanity that is still meaningful today. John is the least historical of the Gospels, but it is without doubt that John is the most theological and also the most spiritual of all the Gospels. John lays out his theology of humanity as his way of putting first things first. Foundational to John's gospel is not just his identifying Jesus as the Son of God, but identifying all humanity as children of God. There is no doubt that John is invoking Genesis by quoting those self-same first words, in the beginning. Those are the exact words of the book of Genesis, and John was cueing his community to this fact by using those same words in his gospel telling, in the beginning. But he uses these words to launch into his cosmic chorus, singing the praises of the Logos. The Logos, L-O-G-O-S, the Word. The Word became flesh. Logos is the Greek word for word, and it represents not just words on a printed page. No, not at all. It represents the creative power of God's speech, the creative power of the Creator God. For after all, things came to be when God spoke, or the Word acted. The Word acted in Genesis when God said, "Let there be light." The Word acted when God said, "Let us make humankind." So for John's theology, the Word, the Logos, becomes flesh to make again humankind divine. The Word becomes flesh to speak again, saying, "Let there be life. Let there be life." The Word becomes flesh and speaks again, saying, "Let life be a light in all people." The Word speaks again, saying, "Let the light in every person shine. Shine in the dark places. And wherever the light shines, darkness will not be able to overcome it." The traditional interpretation is that these verses tell us about the true nature of Jesus, the Son of God. But these verses speak to me about the true nature of human beings. It tells me that we are created to be people of light. We are created to be people of life. We are created to be children of God. But too many of us don't know who we are. Too many of us live in darkness. Too many of us live in death. Too many of us not only do not see our own light, but do not see the light that is in other human beings. And when we live in darkness, bad things happen. When we live in darkness, we abuse and use other human beings for our profit, for our benefit, even for our entertainment. How else do we explain the children around this world who labor from as young as 5 and 6 every day of their lives in sweatshops, on rock piles, all around the world? How else do we explain the sex trafficking of children and women and men all around this planet, except we are living in darkness? How else do we explain the ceaseless and unending wars, the genocide, the racism, the xenophobia that afflicts us, except to say we are living in darkness? How else do we explain the misogyny around the world, from mild to vicious, that cuts off the prospects and hopes and futures of girls and women in every nation on this planet? And so John speaks into this darkness, this word of life, this word of light. John came to tell the world about the light of all people. John came to announce to the world that in this Jesus we find a way back to our original intent, back to being people of light and people of life. And so now it is our turn. It is ours to live in the light and not in darkness. It is ours to turn on the light in every person that we see. That's our job. And it's not an easy job. I wish it were. I wish it were as easy as me saying, Chris, come here. Now, let's see. Now, where's your light switch? Oh, here it is. Click. If it were that easy, this world would be a much better place. But it's not. It calls for all of us first to find our own light switch, to turn our own light on, and to live in the light and not live in darkness. It starts with each of us. It starts with each of us to turn our light on and then to see with that light the light of life in every other human being. And not to see any other human being as a thing to be used and utilized, but as a person, a human being created in the image of God. That's our job as Christians, to live in the light and to walk our light into those dark places, knowing, believing, and trusting that no matter how dark it is, it will not overcome the light that God has put in us. Even that one candle, the darkness of the night cannot extinguish it. And so we are in this world. It takes a lot to live, to be a living light in a world of darkness. It takes a lot to be a light-bearing life. It takes a lot to confront and to challenge that darkness wherever we find it and call it what it is. It takes a lot for us to walk into those places of darkness where people have lost hope and live in total despair, and then for us to proclaim good news. And that the good news is that the Word became flesh and dwells with us and in us. And if we would but let our lights shine, then life will emerge in all the dark places, and that light will shine. The same light that was at the beginning, the same light that is in us will shine through the world, and we will be what God calls us to be, the children of God. Let the people of God say, amen.